Last week we talked about Isaac and Rebekah and what can happen if parents play favorites with their children. Well, today we're going to be seeing the results of that and the fierce rivalry that occurred between their sons, Jacob and Esau, today on this week's lesson. Hello, welcome to this week's lesson. I am Brian Vermeer. Today we're going to be in Genesis chapter 27 for a little bit, but mostly in Genesis chapter 41. We're going to be looking at what happened to the sons of Isaac and Rebekah that we talked about last week. Jacob and Esau. Remember, Esau was his father Isaac's favorite son. Jacob was his mother Rebekah's favorite son. And because of that, these two boys really didn't get along with each other too well. And it got to the point where Jacob tricked Esau out of taking his birthright, that is, his right to have a double portion of the inheritance, and the blessing that Isaac was going to give to Esau before he died. Well, we're picking up in Genesis chapter 27, almost right after where we left off last week. Jacob went into Isaac disguised as Esau, gave him a meal that his mother had cooked, and Isaac blessed Jacob, saying, "You're going to become a great nation, and other nations will serve you," and all that. And then Jacob leaves. Esau comes in almost right afterwards. And when Esau comes in, he says, "Here, Dad, here's the food that I cooked for you. Now, can you give me your blessing?" And we're going to start here in verses 35 to 37 of Genesis chapter 27. But he, Isaac, replied, "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing." So he, Esau, said, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob? For he's cheated me twice now. He took my birthright, and look, now he has taken my blessing." Then he asked, "Haven't you saved a blessing for me?" But Isaac answered Esau, "Look, I have made him a master over you, have given him all of his relatives as his servants, and have sustained him with grain and new wine. What then can I do for you, my son?" Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. And Esau determined in his heart, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." So when Esau asks for his blessing, Isaac replies, "I thought that was you, and I gave the blessing to the one who was just in here." And then Isaac realizes that it was Jacob who had come in. Now, he was a little suspicious before, because when Jacob came in disguise, Esau noticed that the voice he was hearing sounded like Jacob. But then he pulled him close. He felt the hair that Jacob had covered his arms with. He smelled Esau's clothes on Jacob, and that's what convinced him. Remember, Isaac was blind at this time as well, so he couldn't see which son it was that came in. So Isaac realizes, he says here, "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing." So Esau says, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob?" Remember, we said last week the name Jacob means one who grasps, one who takes, you might say. He says, "Because he's cheated me twice now. First, he took my birthright." Now, that was not a cheat. That was Esau trading his birthright for a bowl of stew. Esau came in from the field. He was tired. He was hungry. Jacob had a pot of stew he had just cooked. Esau says, "Give me some of that." Jacob says, "Only if you trade me your birthright for it." So maybe it was a little underhanded, but nothing really, deceitful about that. Esau willingly traded his birthright. He said, "What good's my birthright to me if I die of hunger?" So he just kind of, didn't really care at the moment. He didn't realize Jacob was taking it seriously. And then Esau says, "Look, now he's taken my blessing." So he asks Isaac, "Don't you have a blessing left for me?" Now, blessings were very important back then. People believe that these blessings, these are things that would come true. They felt that this was, God speaking through their father, telling them, what was going to happen, how they were going to find success in the future. But it says, Isaac answered Esau. He says, I've made him the master over you. I've given him all his relatives as servants. So we're talking about here, Isaac has told Jacob, your and your descendants are going to be the masters over all of your relatives and their families. For example, Esau and his descendants, the Edomites. Your uncle Lot, great uncle Lot, and his descendants, the Moabites and the Ammonites. They're going to be servants of Jacob's descendants. Jacob's descendants become the nation of Israel. He's saying Israel is going to be in charge of the Edomites and the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Canaanites and all these other tribes that they are related to. He says, no, Jacob is going to be the one in charge of them. They're going to end up being Israel's servants. And he says, I've sustained him with grain and new wine. I've told him that, he's going to be very prosperous. He's going to become rich. He's going to achieve a lot in his life, and his descendants are going to become a very powerful nation. He says, no, what can I do for you, Esau? I don't have anything left. There's nothing left I can say about you that I haven't already said about him. And, and Isaac felt that he couldn't take the blessing back from Jacob. This was given by God. So he couldn't take it back from Jacob and now give it to Esau. So because of this, it says Esau held a grudge against Jacob. If Esau didn't like Jacob before, now he has got an outright hate. He is holding a grudge against his brother. A grudge is one of the worst things that you can have. It gets to the point, someone does something to you. And yes, to Jacob and Esau, this was a serious matter. But oftentimes, someone does something to us that's really not that big of a deal. But for whatever reason, we just get to where we don't like that person because they did that. And it starts with, I don't like what you did. But after a while, it evolves into, I don't like you. And then it gets to, I don't like anything about you or your family or anything to do with it. And pretty soon you've gotten to the point where you just hate that other person, and you may have even forgotten what started it. You may have forgotten why. As Christians, we are not to hold grudges, and I know this can be hard. There are people who have done things to me that when I see them, I just want to avoid them. I don't want to have to talk to them because I've still got this feeling, and I pray, that God will help me, get over these feelings. We need to make up with people. If someone has done something wrong to you, go tell them. Let them know, look, you may not realize it, but when you did this, it offended me. It made me feel bad. I didn't like this. And forgive me because of the way I've felt about it since then. That person may not have even realized they did anything that you didn't like. So try not to hold grudges against other people. In this case with Esau, it says it got to the point Esau held a grudge against Jacob, and it says Esau determined in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are approaching. In other words, my father is going to die. He's going to die soon, and when he dies, we'll have the period of mourning. But as soon as that is over, I'm going to kill my brother Jacob. Now, the joke is kind of on him here because Isaac goes on to live at least another 20 years. A lot of people don't realize that. We think that Isaac did this just before he died. But no, Isaac goes on to live at least another 20 years after this. And that can be a long time to nurse a grudge. Well, Rebekah overhears this. She knows that Jacob's life is in danger. So she wants to get him out of the house. She goes to Isaac and she says, I don't want Jacob marrying any of these foreign Canaanite women like Esau did. So I want to send him to my brother Laban, back over in the land of Haran, which is where Abraham originally came from to come to Israel. And they still had relatives over there. That's where Isaac found Rebekah. That's where he married her. She says, I want to send Jacob over there to find a wife from among our kinfolk. So he won't be marrying one of these Canaanite women who will lead them astray. And there's actually wisdom there. God would tell the Israelites, don't marry the Canaanites. Don't intermarry, not because they're a foreign people, not because they're Canaanite per se, but because of their religious beliefs. As Christians, we are warned not to intermarry with non-Christians, because instead of us converting our partner to Christ, most likely it will end up the other way around. Our partner is going to pull us away from our faith. So it's good advice not to marry outside your own faith. It's not a racial thing. It's not a prejudice thing or anything like that. It's just marry someone who is also a Christian, so that way you can worship God together. And that will not become a dividing point between you two. You won't get like so many couples where one goes to church weekly, but the partner doesn't. And there's a point of strife anytime it's brought up. So Rebekah says, let me send Jacob to my brother Laban over in Haran. And there's this whole thing here. Jacob goes to Laban. He sees that Laban has two daughters, Leah and Rachel, or Leah and Rachel. And Jacob immediately falls in love with the younger daughter, Rachel. And he says, tells Laban, I want to marry your daughter, Rachel. And Laban says, okay, tell you what, you work for me for 7 years, and I'll give you Rachel as a bride. So Jacob works for 7 years for the right to marry Rachel, and it says, that 7 years passed very quickly for him because he was so much in love. And then the wedding comes, and during the wedding, the bride comes out, and she's got a veil over her face and looks so pretty. And she comes out, and they have the wedding ceremony, and they have the wedding feast, and Jacob probably gets a little bit drunk. And when evening comes, it's gotten dark, he goes into his tent to consummate his marriage, which he does. And he wakes up the next morning and finally gets a good look at the face of his bride, and it's not Rachel, it's her older sister, Leah. And he runs out, and he immediately gets on to Laban for tricking him like this. The trickster ended up getting tricked. Jacob, who took the birthright and the blessing from his brother Esau, ended up getting one-upped by his uncle Laban. The excuse Laban had was, well, in our country, we don't marry the younger daughter off until the older daughter is married. So I'll tell you what, I'll let you go ahead and marry Rachel too, if you will work for me for another 7 years. Jacob doesn't see any way around this. He really wants to marry Rachel. So he does, he agrees, he marries Rachel and works for Laban for another 7 years. He ends up having a total of eventually 12 sons and one daughter. At least one daughter. First of all, Leah has some children. Rachel doesn't have any children. Leah has some children. Rachel gets jealous. Rachel gives her handmaid to Jacob. He has some children with her. Leah then gives her handmaid to Jacob. He has some children with her. He then has some more children with Leah. And then finally, he has a son with Rachel, whom he names Joseph. And repeating the sins of his father, Joseph becomes his favorite son. And next week, we're going to look at what happens because Jacob did not learn the lesson about playing favorites among your kids. But the point is, Jacob ends up with, by the time we're getting here to Genesis 33, Jacob has 11 sons and one daughter by 4 different women. Now, God, I want to stress here, God nowhere condones any of this. Nowhere does God say this was right. God does not say that what Laban did was right in tricking Jacob and making him, have to marry 2 women. God does not say that Jacob was right to have children by 4 different women while he's married to 2 of them. Just because people in the Bible do things does not mean that those things are right. Polygamy is never something that God has commanded. It is never something that God has told us we should do. But then Jacob works for Laban for 7 years for Leah, 7 years for Rachel, and then at least another 6 years for some sheep and goats. He asks Laban, if I can have a share of your sheep and goats to raise as my own, because I don't have anything. I've been working for you all this time. I don't have anything of my own. So Laban says, okay, you can work, with the sheep and goats. And Jacob says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll take as my pay then. All of the sheep and goats that are born that have spots or stripes, any that aren't pure, I'll take them for my own. And God blesses Jacob and makes the majority of the flock be born that way. So Jacob becomes very wealthy. He then decides just to up and leave Laban before anything else, can go wrong. So he leaves and goes back home to mom and dad. But he's not sure how his brother Esau still feels. It's been 20 years since Jacob and Esau have seen each other. And when he left, Esau was ready to kill him. Jacob thinks or assumes that Esau's hate has been just festering over these 20 years. So he comes up with this plan. He divides his caravan up into groups. He puts, we'll talk about it here in a minute in our reading here. But in the first few groups, he includes a whole bunch of gifts. He says, as we approach home, if you see Esau, go to Esau and say, these things are for you from your brother Jacob. And there's 3 or 4 of those that he sends, just camels and all kinds of things full of wonderful gifts for his brother. Now let's pick up with Genesis chapter 33, verses 1 to 4. It says, now Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming toward him with 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 slave women. He put the slaves and their children first, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. He himself went on ahead and bowed to the ground 7 times until he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet him, hugged him, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Then they wept. Jacob has sent all these gifts up ahead. It says he then divides his caravan into 4 groups here. He goes ahead by himself. He then has a group which has the 2 slave women and their children. Then a little distance apart, he's got Leah and her children. And then a little distance after that, he's got Rachel and Joseph. Now, the reason he does this is because he sees Esau coming, and Esau's got 400 men with him. Jacob assumes this is an army that has come to kill him. He says, if I divide my wives and kids into groups, if one of them gets attacked, maybe the others can escape. And if you look at the order he puts them in, you can see the importance he places his wives and kids. He says first he has the slave women and their children. They were the least important. They were the ones that he could, maybe let Esau kill them and maybe he'd be satisfied. But just in case they still weren't satisfied, then he's got Leah and her children. And maybe by the time his men get through attacking them, maybe Rachel and Joseph can get away since they're in the back group. So we even see here, Jacob is already playing favorites among his wives and his children. He has not learned the lesson of his parents. And again, next week we're going to see how that causes problems. But he is scared to death of his brother. He goes up, and as he approaches Esau, it says he bows down 7 times. Bowing down is showing submission. It is kind of an I surrender sign. He's telling Esau, look, if it's me you want, here I am. Leave my wives and kids alone. So what happens? What does Esau do when he meets Jacob? It says he ran up and he immediately hugged him. And let's continue on now, verses 8 through 11. It says, so Esau said, what do you mean by this whole procession I met? To find favor with you, my lord, he answered. I have enough, my brother, Esau replied. Keep what you have. But Jacob said, no, please, if I found favor with you, take this gift from me. For indeed, I have seen your face, and it's like seeing God's face, since you have accepted me. Please take my present that was brought to you, because God has been gracious to me, and I have everything I need. So Jacob urged him until he accepted. Esau asks Jacob, what is this? I received all these camels and all these gifts, from you. And now I see, you've got, this other, you've still got a whole caravan behind you here. What's the meaning of all this? And Jacob says, I'm trying to make up with you. Again, for all he knew, Esau had been nursing this hatred for 20 years. Jacob is ready to make up. Jacob does not want to live the rest of his life on the run. If you have someone who does not like you, for your part, you need to do the best you can to make up with that person. Find out what the problem is. Why does that person not like you? And maybe we can fix that. Maybe there's something you can do about that. Maybe there's nothing you can do and that person just won't like you. And if that's the case, then that's between him and God. But you, for your part, need to try to live peacefully with all people. You need to try to make up with everyone who has something against you. That's what Jacob does here, and it works. Now, we don't know if Esau had already made up. He probably had. Esau had probably already forgiven Jacob because Esau became a great nation himself. Esau had lots of children. Esau became very wealthy. So he probably had already forgiven Jacob, because he probably felt, well, even without Isaac's blessing, even without Dad's blessing, I still have become, wealthy myself, so I'm not going to hold it against my brother. But something interesting we see here, first of all, Jacob says, I've seen your face, and it's like seeing God's face, and I think that's kind of interesting, because just the night before, Jacob was very worried, and he went out and he walked by himself for a while. And it says a man came and wrestled with him until daybreak. And we find out that this man is actually God in the form of a human. This is what in the Bible we call a theophany. This is an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. God came to earth as a person. That is, the man Jesus Christ. And it says he wrestled with Jacob until daybreak, work out some of that anxiety that he's got. And Jacob kept wrestling. It says the man finally touched Jacob's hip and his hip went out of socket. But Jacob wouldn't give up. He kept on wrestling. And finally the man says, let me go. Day's breaking. And Jacob says, I won't go until you bless me. He wants a legitimate blessing from God. And the man says, what's your name? He says, my name's Jacob. He says, well, no longer will you be called Jacob. You will be called Israel, because you have struggled with God and have overcome. And then I love what happens right afterward. Jacob says, well, what's your name? And the man says, why do you ask my name? And disappears. In other words, you know who I am. So it's interesting because, he says, to Esau, I've seen your face, and it's like seeing God's face. The night before, Jacob saw God's face. Jacob had seen God the night before. But Jacob here is just simply using a simile here. Since you've accepted me, I feel so good right now because just like I feel when I see God. Since we have made up, since you have forgiven me. It's amazing what a little forgiveness can do. Just knowing that someone doesn't hold that grudge against you anymore. And then he says, I think this is also interesting too. He insists that Esau keep all of these gifts that he's given. Esau tries to give the gifts back. He says, look, I'm wealthy. I don't need any of this stuff. I don't need any of these gifts. So please take them back. And Jacob is saying, no, please, you keep them. And I guess part of this is because Jacob is feeling guilty. He took Esau's birthright. He took Esau's blessing deceitfully. Now he's trying to give back. He's trying to make up. He's trying to use material methods to make up for what he has done. You might call it, a guilt offering that he's giving to Esau. He's saying, please keep all that. And I guess that way Esau can never say that Jacob never gave anything back to him. The whole point here is, don't let hate rule your life. Don't let your hatred for someone, or don't let a small dislike for someone turn into a hate, especially for family members. If there's anyone who has anything against you, God tells us to go and make up with that person. Jesus says, if you've got anything against someone else, leave your gift at the altar. Go make up with that person before you give your gift to God. That person may not accept it, but at least you've done your part. Next week, we're going to look at what happens when Jacob plays favorites among his sons and what that can lead to. So I'll see you again next week.